going to be 4 o'clock in 30 seconds.
Yeah, we start at 4:19.
Oh, right. Put this in my pocket.
Oh, do you guys want these casts?
It's okay.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's February 28th, 2020. I'm Tay Glass.
And I'm Emily Pizzacreta. New York's ban on plastic bags is starting this weekend, but will it make the city more environmentally friendly?
There's definitely a shift towards paper bags because plastic bags are no longer offered, but the overall level of disposable bag use goes down.
President Trump announced that he's suing the New York Times for libel. The case has the potential to change libel standards. It could also benefit Trump.
Trump will use the lawsuit as part of his political strategy if he made a campaign promise to kind of rein in out-of-line media.
And Medicaid is costing New York more than expected.
The state is struggling to figure out how do you simultaneously cut costs while at the same time ensuring that a needy and vulnerable population receives the care and services that they need.
All that and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Barbara Klein. The World Health Organization is raising the alert level for the coronavirus as the outbreak expands to 5 more countries since yesterday, and world markets continue to plummet. The Dow is down, fell several percentage points today. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell is trying to reassure jittery investors. NPR's Scott Horsley reports Powell issued a rare statement today saying the central bank is prepared to cut interest rates if necessary.
In his statement, the Fed chairman stressed the fundamentals of the U.S. economy are still strong, but he acknowledged the rapidly spreading coronavirus poses, quote, evolving risks to economic activity. Powell says the Federal Reserve is closely monitoring the virus, adding that he and his colleagues will use our tools and act as appropriate to support the economy. The Fed's next scheduled meeting is in 2.5 weeks. The Fed had previously signaled it would leave interest rates unchanged unless the economy took a turn for the worse. In the wake of this week's market slide, though, investors are now anticipating multiple rate cuts this year. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
The Dow fell 1.33% today. The S&P was off 0.8%. Turkey is trying to put pressure on the European Union for more support in northern Syria. As Terry Schultz reports, Ankara is using its control over migrant flows as leverage.
Even though there are Turkish television broadcasts of Syrians moving toward EU borders and photographs of a rubber dinghy arriving from Turkey to Greece, the European Commission says Ankara has assured it of no change in the policy that requires migrants to be blocked. This despite the Turkish president's spokesman saying the country can no longer manage the increasing number of displaced Syrians. The EU has no role in the military conflict in Syria, but it has been critical of all sides there for creating a humanitarian disaster.
Democratic presidential contenders are making their final push before voters go to the polls in South Carolina tomorrow. NPR's Windsor Johnston reports.
The South Carolina primary is the last of the 4 early state contests and the first major test of African-American support for the Democratic contenders. Elaine Kmark, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, says support from the state's black population could give former Vice President Joe Biden a much-needed boost going forward.
If he has a good, solid victory there, then I suspect African-American voters on Super Tuesday and then in subsequent states will give him another look, and that, I think, will be to his advantage.
Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders heads into Saturday's race as the Democratic frontrunner after back-to-back wins in New Hampshire and Nevada. Windsor Johnston, NPR News.
This is
From Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Lauren Peace. Pedestrian deaths are up from last year. 22 people have been killed since the beginning of the year, the most recent a 7-year-old boy. The child was struck by a Jeep while walking home with his mother in Brooklyn on Thursday afternoon. He's the second child to die in a traffic accident this week. A 10-year-old girl was struck and killed by a school bus at a crosswalk just 3 days earlier. The accidents took place less than 2 miles apart and have prompted lawmakers to consider safety reforms. City Council is considering legislation that would regulate food delivery services like Grubhub and Uber Eats. The push comes after local restaurant owners said the added costs of using the services are putting them out of business. Legislation proposed by Bronx Councilman Mark Jonai would cap delivery fees at 10% commission and require dealers to register for a license with the Department of Consumer Affairs. Jonai said the push is about keeping local restaurants afloat.
Your information is completely confidential. By law, it cannot be shared with anyone.
Hearings on the bill are scheduled to start in April. New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Hamilton star Lin-Manuel Miranda are teaming up to encourage New York City residents to participate in the 2020 census. In an ad released on Twitter, the two public figures stress that the census count is for everyone, regardless of immigration status. The push stems from concerns that undocumented residents won't participate, which could negatively impact community funding. Temperatures are going to stay cold this weekend. It's currently 41 degrees and sunny, and it's expected to drop into the 20s by Saturday morning. Today is February 28th, but don't set your calendars to March just yet. Tomorrow is February 29th. From Columbia Radio News, I'm Lauren Peace.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Tay Glass.
And I'm Emily Pizzacreta.
Earlier this week, the Trump campaign announced that it's suing the New York Times for libel. The lawsuit claims that an op-ed said the Trump campaign had a deal with Russia to defeat Hillary Clinton in 2016, something the Trump campaign argues the Times knew wasn't true. Asim Shukla reports on why the case was filed and what it might mean.
President Trump has often expressed frustration with the media.
We have a very crooked media. It's frankly disgusting the way the press is able to write whatever they want to write. I've never seen more dishonest media.
He's even campaigned on the idea of reining the media in.
So we're going to open up those libel laws, folks, and we're going to have people sue you like you never got sued before.
But the thing about libel is that it's governed by a Supreme Court ruling from 1964, in a case where an Alabama sheriff sued the New York Times for publishing an ad that contained factual inaccuracies. That ruling made it really hard for public figures to win libel suits. And that's because of a standard called actual malice. Stuart Carl teaches media law at Columbia and used to be general counsel at the Wall Street Journal.
And what it basically says is if a public official wants to recover for defamation, it has to show that the journalist, in this case, published the statement knowing it was false, so basically lied about it, or acted in reckless disregard of whether it was true or false.
Carl doesn't think that a court will see Max Frankel, who wrote the Times op-ed, in quite that way.
I do not believed he was lying. I don't think he was uninformed. You add those two things together, I think there's virtually no prospect this will meet the standard of actual malice.
But Lisa George, a media economist at Hunter College, thinks that even if the Trump campaign loses in the lower courts, the case could make its way to the Supreme Court. In fact, she thinks that's exactly what the Trump campaign is hoping for.
I think that the case was brought with the entire objective of changing the standard at the Supreme Court. Justice Thomas has expressed an interest in revisiting the case that changed the libel rules to loosen standards on media.
In other words, the campaign may hope to weaken the actual malice standard the court set back in 1964. But even if the law doesn't change, George thinks the case still works as a kind of campaign tactic.
Trump will use the lawsuit as part of his political strategy if he made a campaign promise to kind of rein in out-of-line media.
And she thinks getting sued might also have an upside for the Times.
The New York Times is going to be in the news. It will cement its position as sort of fighting a good fight.
The Times gets to be a defender of the free press, just like it did in 1964. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Asim Shukla.
When you visit a New York City grocery store or deli, your purchases probably come in a thin plastic bag. More than 27 million of the bags are given out daily in the city.
But as of March 1st, stores will no longer be allowed to give out free plastic bags. Instead, customers will pay for paper or bring their own reusable bags. Sarah Gelbard explores the impacts of this change.
In New York City, thin plastic bags are a part of everyday life.
I use plastic bags to store my diaries when I'm traveling so that they don't get wet or dirty.
And I use plastic bags to pick up my dog's poop.
I use plastic bags to take my lunch to school.
And I use plastic bags to throw out my trash.
This weekend, that is going to change. Restaurants, supermarkets, grocery stores, and bodegas will no longer be allowed to use thin plastic bags. Instead, they'll hand out paper bags for a 5-cent fee. Tatiana Homanoff is an assistant professor of economics at NYU. She expects the new policy will reduce waste from all disposable bags.
Similar policies have been passed in California, and those have been shown to be very effective at curbing the use of all disposable bags. There's definitely a shift towards paper bags because plastic bags are no longer offered, but the overall level of disposable bag use goes down.
David Tyler is a professor of chemistry at the University of Oregon. He says that while switching to paper bags will reduce plastic pollution in landfills and waterways, the carbon footprint from paper bag production is actually double that of plastic.
And the solid waste that is produced in the manufacture of paper is 5 or 6 times that of the solid waste produced when you make a plastic bag.
Tyler says the best solution is reusable tote bags made from recycled plastics.
So maybe you recycle a drink bottle or something like that, and then they convert that into a tote bag.
Jason Wadsworth is a sustainability director for Wegmans grocery stores. He says the chain ran a test of the plastic bag ban last summer and found that instead of paying for paper bags, most customers were switching to reusable ones.
We were seeing reuse rates above 70%. It does cost more to use paper bags than it does plastic bags, which is why our goal all along was to make this a program about reusable bags, not about paper bags.
Many stores in the city now have reusable bags for sale. Tito Castillo works at Thrifty Deli in Morningside Heights. Standing at the cash register, he pulls out a bright green, thick plastic bag from behind the counter.
This bag is made from recycled material and it's eco-friendly, non-toxic. You can use it 125 more times than a regular black bag, and it's recyclable. So it's from recycled plastic.
Starting Sunday, Thrifty Deli will offer this reusable bag to customers for 15 to 20 cents each. Sarah Gelbard, Columbia Radio News.
Mayor Bill de Blasio wants New York City to get to a point where no one dies from traffic-related incidents by 2024. For the first few years, his plan, Vision Zero, saw a reduction in the number of deaths.
But last year there was a spike. And so far this year, there have been 22 pedestrian fatalities. Just yesterday, a 7-year-old boy was struck and killed by a car in East New York. Peter Kosmeyer runs the Citizens Committee for New York City, which aims to improve the quality of life for New Yorkers in low-income neighborhoods. I asked him why Vision Zero seems to be backsliding. What do you think is stopping New York City from achieving Vision Zero?
The most basic and most important impediment is really an unwillingness on the part even of the people who live in the city and its political leadership to do something about automobiles in New York City. We have just adopted not very long ago something called traffic congestion or congestion pricing, which will charge people a fee to drive into the central business district of Manhattan, which will reduce traffic somewhat. But that's been a long time coming, and it's something that should have been done a long time ago. Some of this actually is taking place in New York, and I think we need to give credit to the mayor and to political leadership for doing it. 14th Street from river to river has now been turned into a major road across the city where there's much less traffic. Traffic is essentially banned except for public buses, emergency vehicles.
2 of these recent deaths involved young children. How can we make the streets safer for children specifically?
All of us who do drive from time to time know that there are things that kind of naturally slow us down. The way the street is designed, the way intersections are designed. All of these are things that can be done. So we need to make sure that all the traffic lights are working. We need to make sure that we have much better street design, not only where there are lots of kids, but especially where there are lots of kids.
Why do you think these two incidents involving children happened in the same neighborhood?
These are neighborhoods where there are lots of kids. They are areas also where we hadn't taken a number of the steps I think that should be taken in terms of redesigning intersections, making sure that all lights are working. One individual involved in one of these accidents had a driver's license, in fact, removed. So that raises a whole issue of enforcement.
Do you think it has anything to do with the fact that East New York is a low-income, predominantly black neighborhood?
Well, I think it's hard always to rule that out. The fact of the matter is that in neighborhoods which have less political power and are less heard and are less seen and are more invisible to the power structure, you're going to have more problems. Whether it's the kind of things we're talking about today in terms of the safety of children crossing the streets, I think that's something that's sadly and unfortunately almost always true here in New York and everywhere.
Are there any cities that do this especially well, and how do they achieve that goal?
Well, there are cities that do this very well. London, for example, some years ago, long before New York, adopted congestion pricing to reduce the level of traffic in central London. This plan, Vision Zero, actually comes from a plan in Sweden and has been adopted in many cities in Scandinavia, small and large as well, and is working quite effectively.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Have a good day.
A bill pending in the New York State Legislature could help protect rights for parents having children with the help of third-party reproduction technologies. That includes sperm, egg, and embryo donation. The bill would also legalize paid surrogacy, when a woman is paid to carry a baby for someone else. And that's been controversial. Lauren Peace reports.
For the last several years, Alexis Sorrell has been working as a family and reproductive rights lawyer in New York City. Her practice is personal.
My husband and I had years of fertility treatments. It was heartbreaking and grueling physically.
And she says the treatments didn't work. So her doctor recommended she turn to gestational surrogacy. That's when an embryo biologically connected to the intended parents is implanted into the uterus of a woman who then carries the baby to term. But when Sorrell and her husband began researching their options,
we found out that we can't do it in New York. It's illegal in New York.
New York is one of 2 states in the country that bans gestational surrogacy. In other states, surrogacy is either loosely regulated or there are no laws in place. That can make things really difficult for families struggling with infertility and LGBT families who want biological children. Sorrell learned from her own experience.
And it motivated me to get into this field of law.
Now Sorrell is part of a growing coalition working to pass the Child Parent Security Act, which would overhaul New York's parentage laws and could set legal standards across the country. So far, the legislation, which would make paid surrogacy legal, has been popular among key lawmakers. The New York Attorney General announced her support, and Governor Andrew Cuomo has named the bill a priority. But some feminists, including Gloria Steinem, have spoken out against it.
My name is Jennifer Lahl, and I'm the president of the Center for Bioethics and Culture, which actually runs the international campaign called Stop Surrogacy Now.
Lahl says that surrogates face health risks. Pregnancy can be dangerous, and paying young women to carry a baby could be a slippery slope.
Once you commercialize it, then the industry moves in. And so it really brings in this whole market, commodification and baby buying and baby selling industry.
And Lahl says that could lead to the exploitation of low-income women, a stance that lawmakers have taken in Europe, where paid surrogacy is mostly illegal. But it's a complicated issue, in part because law governing third-party reproduction in New York was enacted in the early 1970s. That's before the technology that made surrogacy, embryo, and egg donation possible had even been developed, which creates problems. For example, there's nothing in place that terminates the rights of a sperm, egg, or embryo donor after the donation is made. As for paid gestational surrogacy, a state senator has introduced counter legislation, which currently sits in the Senate's Judiciary Committee. The fate of both bills will be determined later this year. Lauren Peace, Columbia Radio News.
You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Emily Pizzacreta.
And I'm Tay Glass.
Coming up, Governor Andrew Cuomo wants to cut Medicaid spending in New York City.
And we'll hear about a Harlem photographer who's the first African American to have a collection in the Library of Congress.
Stay tuned for these stories and more. Governor Andrew Cuomo recently released the 2021 state budget, and it includes a $6 billion deficit. The majority of the deficit, just over $4 billion, comes from unexpected increases in spending for Medicaid. And the governor has tasked a government panel with finding cuts in the healthcare program. But many low-income New York City residents rely on Medicaid for essential long-term care. Lucas Brady Woods reports.
On Wednesday, she had a fragrant curry chicken simmering on the stove. The living room was clean but cluttered with medication bottles and packaging.
This is Prazista, which is part of my HIV/AIDS care. The skin cancer that I have, this is a dexamethason. So all these is the basic medications that I take.
Cooper has been living with AIDS for 25 years. She also suffers from multiple forms of cancer. She says her Medicaid coverage is essential.
I need the assistance of the home health aide. I need the assistance of my infectious disease specialist, and I need my medications. These medications have to be taken religiously every day, or I will become resistant and I will die of AIDS.
Cooper is not alone. Hundreds of thousands of other New Yorkers also rely on Medicaid for their long-term care. It's a major driving factor in the rising healthcare costs for the state, and Governor Cuomo has flagged long-term care as a target for cuts. To find those cuts, he's asking the state's Medicaid redesign team to identify $2.5 billion in savings just from Medicaid. Here's Governor Cuomo speaking about the team in his annual budget address earlier this month.
Here are their mandate. 0 impact on local governments. 0 impact on beneficiaries. Find industry efficiencies and or additional industry revenue, root out waste, fraud, and abuse, and get this done in time for the April 1 budget.
Michael Sparer is the chair of the Department of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University. He says it's not immediately clear how to make substantial cuts to Medicaid while preserving needed care.
The state is struggling right now. The state is struggling to figure out how do you simultaneously cut costs while at the same time ensuring that a needy and vulnerable population receives the care and services that they need. And that's a complicated process to do all those things at once.
Sparer says the root of the problem is that the United States has an inefficient and inadequate long-term care system.
Until we develop a really effective system that provides needed health and social services to elderly and disabled populations, we're going to be dealing with these issues.
After the Medicaid redesign team releases their recommendations, the budget enters the implementation phase when the governor begins to distribute funds across the state. We reached out to Governor Cuomo's office for more specifics on the plan, but they declined to comment. Lucas Brady Woods, Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio, Voices of the City.
I grew up in Dubai. My family's from Bombay, India, and I've been living in New York since 2017.
Fida Yamani, New York skeptic turned New York lover, Morningside Heights.
That New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2017, was one of the coldest New Year's Eves since 1920. So it was the coldest New Year's Eve in almost 100 years. I had never experienced cold like that in my entire life. And my first thought was, I am miserable. I don't think I'm ever going to get used to the cold. However, I feel like New York is a place where within a few weeks, if not a few months, you end up feeling like a New Yorker. To be a New Yorker, I could be wrong on this, but this is what it means. That while you're here, you shit on the city, but when you're out of here, you miss it every day of your life. And that is what New York has given me within these few years.
You're listening to Columbia Radio News, online Fridays at 4 p.m.
How many kids should be in each New York City classroom? That's been the subject of debate in the city for decades. And it was the subject of a packed hearing at City Hall this morning, where several dozen education activists argued the city and state need to do more to shrink the size of classrooms throughout the city. Jamaris Perez reports.
It's 10:15, and in the City Hall committee room, activists, parents, and former teachers are sitting elbows to elbows. A few times, a guard makes a futile attempt to quiet the crowd.
Please keep the volume down. Please keep the volume down.
In a way, the commotion mirrors one of the very issues being discussed this morning. Despite previous efforts, New York City class sizes are still among the largest in the state. And that's troubling for Tanisha Grant, a parent of a 7th grader.
He's having a hard time with the English language arts curriculum, so I have to do what I have to do as a mother to help him with his homework. But if we had smaller class sizes and more teachers, then, and diverse teachers that could help him break down the language, it would be beneficial to our children. So I don't know why I can see that as a parent, and people that are in office, I have to explain it to.
A representative from the city's Department of Education said that shrinking class size, though a priority for the city, can't happen without additional support from New York State. And that current class sizes are actually below what's specified in the city's contract with the union that represents teachers. But Councilman Mark Traeger, the chair of the City Council's Committee on Education, said this isn't just a state issue.
Even in this difficult budget season, we all need to continue the struggle for adequate state funding for our schools. At the same time, we can't let the city off the hook. We have to hold everyone accountable for their efforts, or lack thereof, to make progress on class size reduction, particularly for our most disadvantaged students, who would benefit most from smaller classes.
Disadvantaged students, like English language learners, students with special needs, and low-income minority students, who struggle the most in larger class settings. Class Size Matters, which testified at the hearing, wants the city to spend $100 million of the Department of Education's budget to hire 1,000 new teachers next year. Miriam Aristi-Ferrer is a member of the group.
I mean, at the end of the day, we have enough money for luxury housing. Why don't we have enough money for public schools?
But shrinking class size alone shouldn't be considered a magic bullet to solve all the city's education issues, says Dr. Jeffrey Young. He's a professor at Columbia's Teachers College.
Simply changing the math and saying, okay, we're going to have 15 kids instead of 25. If the quality of instruction does not take advantage of that, it's not going to make much of a difference.
He says class size becomes important when it gives teachers the chance to connect with students one-on-one. It's about creating the conditions under which teachers can do their best teaching so that students can do their best learning. Jamaris Perez, Columbia Radio News.
The Library of Congress has acquired the archives of Harlem-based photographer Sean Walker. This will be the first collection in the library of work by an African-American photographer.
Walker began shooting in the 1960s. His photographs captured daily life on the streets of Harlem. People sitting on stoops, couples walking the street together wearing smart hats, parades. John Edwin Mason is an associate professor of history at the University of Virginia. He says Walker's images of Harlem were unique at a time when many visual artists were misrepresenting African American life.
So much of the photography that was made by, I have to say, white photographers was about African Americans embodying some sort of social problem. John Walker saw African Americans as ordinary folks, and what Sean was doing, especially during the 1960s and into the 70s, working as a street photographer. In fact, he worked as a street photographer, still does. But his street photography was finding beauty in the ordinary, this rare seeing of African Americans as they truly were.
Sean Walker was a member of an important group in the history of photography, the Kamoinge Workshop. Why was the Kamoinge formed, and why was it important for a photographer like Walker?
Kamoinge Workshop was formed as a mutual aid society. It was a way for photographers to encourage and support each other in an atmosphere where they were excluded from galleries and museums and excluded from the profession. For Sean, he'll tell you himself that initially he was self-taught as a photographer. He hadn't gone to art school, hadn't had professional training, and Kamoinge was extremely valuable. He's surrounded by all these really good photographers who know what they're doing, who know how to see, who know how to print, and who know how to develop a career. And I think for somebody like Sean, it was especially valuable.
According to the Library of Congress, this collection of Walker's photography is the first comprehensive archive of an African-American photographer in the library. Why do you think it took until 2020 for that to happen?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I will say that African-American photographers' archives are available in other places, the Schomburg, for instance. There is the Gordon Parks Foundation, which has done a magnificent job of preserving his legacy. So it's not that African Americans have been entirely excluded from the archive, but they have been largely excluded from the archive, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that African Americans in general have been marginalized in American culture, and archivists and curators and historians just haven't seen the work of African-American photographers as central to the history of photography and art in the United States. Now that's changing, and this is a sign of how importantly that's changing. And there is, in fact, an exhibition that's running right now at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts about the Kamoinge Workshop and Lou Draper. So, we can see changes. We can be optimistic. We can. We can be optimistic.
That's a great note to end it on. John Edwin Mason, Associate Professor of History at the University of Virginia, thank you for joining us on Uptown Radio.
It's been my pleasure.
And now, the first installment in our series of personal commentaries. Today, Will Walke recalls a time he was called a hero and why he still doesn't like that label.
Whenever I'm introduced to a member of my girlfriend's family, the first thing they say to me is, "Oh, you're the hero. You saved Gretchen's life." I always laugh and blush and don't know how to respond. Not only because, well, it's all downhill from there, but also because what they're saying is misleading. I went through a traumatic situation straight out of a movie. A scene that ends with me suspended from a helicopter a few hundred feet over the French countryside, but I feel nothing like Superman. My girlfriend and I were studying abroad, and were on a weekend trip to Geneva. We planned on summiting Mont Salève, a mountain that overlooks the city. When we arrived, the trails were a bit uneven and washed out from the snowmelt of early spring. Conditions seemed sketchy, and the main trail to the top was closed. Gretchen and I have both hiked all over the world. We've carried our own water filtration systems, pots and pans, and tents. What was one short hike where all we're carrying is some water bottles, Cliff Bars, and wine? This was our first mistake: arrogance. We took the alternate route. About 30 minutes in, we realized we were completely lost. We should have turned around, but were determined to find the view. So we doubled back and split up. I eventually chose the right path, but Gretchen did not. She ended up on a slope of loose gravel and dirt a few yards away from me. She tried to cross over to where I was and lost her footing. I watched her slip and tumble down some rocks. Finally, she disappeared over the edge of a cliff to a 30-foot drop below. If you take anything away from this story, it's to never split up when you're alone in the woods. I can't say that I screamed or even really reacted to what happened. I just stood there in shock. I finally started skidding on my butt down the slope, following the probable path of her tumble. I eventually found her, pinned up against a dark wood, leafless tree. Later, I found out her impact with the tree trunk had stopped her from tumbling further. She was delirious but conscious. The first and worst thing I noticed was a deep cut down her arm from the top of her shoulder to her elbow. You could see straight through her muscle to the bone. Blood flowed from the cut, glistening like a garnet. Luckily, I knew how to check her vital signs and make a tourniquet for her arm before calling 911. I was fortunate enough to have cell service, and in English and broken French, I relayed to a dispatcher what had happened. 45 minutes later, 3 first responders dropped out of the sky on harnesses suspended from helicopters. They took it from there. Gretchen broke 6 ribs and 8 vertebrae. She was left with a thick scar the length of her upper arm, which she hates because she can't wear dresses without people staring at her. But things could have turned out differently had that tree not been there, or if my phone didn't have service. But it did. Now, my friends and family say I'm a hero, but I don't feel like one. I'll admit I recalled my wilderness training and made a damn good tourniquet. I told Gretchen dumb stories about my dogs for 45 minutes to keep her awake, and I flagged down a helicopter using my t-shirt. I did a lot of things right. But none of that saved her life, and I don't want the credit for it. The reality is, fate kept Gretchen alive. And how can I be the hero when I was just cleaning up my own mess? But people don't like to think about the pure randomness and occasional helplessness this world creates. Who wants to think about the roll of the dice we all take on a daily basis? Gretchen's parents can't thank a forgiving hillside or tree for what happened, so they take comfort in the idea that I saved their daughter. Whenever I think about Gretchen's fall now, I know there's no real hero to her story. But I'm happy to take on that label to help her parents, and maybe myself, get through what happened.
Will's favorite superhero is Iron Man, probably because he had to work for his powers, just like everyone else. He wants to thank Gretchen O'Brien for her consulting role in the story. A new exhibit opens today at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Contemporary Muslim Fashions showcases what Muslim fashions look like today across streetwear, sportswear, and couture. As Brett Forrest reports, the show is meant to break the stereotypes about what modest fashion looks like.
Muslim fashion has 2 jobs. It needs to be stylish, but it also has to be modest. Susan Brown is curator of the Contemporary Muslim Fashions exhibit. She says that modest fashion doesn't have a set definition.
We sort of use Muslim and modest interchangeably throughout the exhibition. Some people will say that the hadith, or the sayings of the Prophet, say that only a woman's face and hands should be shown, depending on different regions of the world, different personal relationships to Islam. People have a lot of different interpretations of modesty in terms of the parameters of what parts of the body have to be covered or not covered.
The exhibit shows how these different definitions of modesty are portrayed by designers around the world, like swimwear from Shireen Sabet of Egypt, a shirt, pants, and hood ensemble in bright blue with a white pattern running down the legs. Or a more high-end look from Indonesian designer Itang Yunaz, a dark blue abaya with an ornate white pattern and jewelry. Silk, cotton, bright colors, elaborate designs. Gone is the stereotype of the black hijab.
To see just happy, laughing, stylish women looking like they're having fun while wearing hijab is unfortunately very unfamiliar to a lot of people.
Brown says too many news images show Muslims as victims of war and terror. She wants the exhibit's designs, photographs, and videos to shine a different light on Muslim women. While many looks are unique to different regions, Brown says they may be different, but there is one common factor.
There's a big population surge with millennial Muslims and their spending power and their social media expertise. So really changing the narrative around fashion and building a really big online community around Muslim modest style.
Brown says platforms like Instagram have been game changers. The exhibit shows how social media is helping to push boundaries.
Over half the designers in the show are Muslim women under 40, and they communicate a great deal on social media, and part of it is sharing their style, but part of it is using fashion as a platform to discuss other social concerns. Fashion can be a way for people to talk about a lot of different subjects, and that's a really interesting intersection.
Aliyah Khan is the chairwoman of the Islamic Fashion and Design Council. She sees the exhibit as an important opportunity to open the door for a new public perception of Muslim style.
For me, the most important thing is that it really allows people to come in, get a glance of the level of beauty that's possible with modesty. It will confirm that this is a very stylish audience, and this group is a match for anyone.
Brett Forrest, Columbia Radio News.
That does it for this edition of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show. Our foreman today was executive producer Megan Cattle. Leading our staff of reporters was executive producer Anya Schultz.
Director Asim Shukla coordinated our studio production with Lucas Brady Woods and Sarah Gelbard. Cecily Morin got the stream live to the web.
Lauren Peace produced the news. Senior editor Kira Long and assistant editor Will Walkie led our copy team.
Our instructors Sally Hership, Tracy Samuelson, Ben Shapiro, and Camille Peterson advised our staff. I'm Emily Pizzacreta.
And I'm Tay Glass. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next time, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.